Hello and welcome to the concluding lecture on cultural diplomacy in a multipolar world. What I'd like to do today is to try to tie together, or let's say sew the line between the different themes that we've discussed in the context of this course. It was a relatively diverse objective. We dealt with the public sector, the private sector, civil society. We dealt with the unilateral forms of cultural diplomacy as well as the multilateral. So that's my attempt to try to bring this all together. And in the end, in my conclusion, I'll give you some recommendations and also a prognosis for what I expect in the future for cultural diplomacy in a multipolar world. So the outline that I've put together is the following. First of all, we asked the question earlier this week, can culture influence the way that people think and act? And we looked at a few different examples, so I want to underline the lessons learned there. Secondly, we discussed the question, what is the need for cultural diplomacy in today's interdependent world? And is it the same as what that need was before, during the Cold War or in other time periods? Thirdly, we discussed primarily the public sector and this transition from unilateral to multilateral cultural diplomacy. Fourthly, we discussed the role of economics and the private sector in today's globalized world. And finally, we had the lecture looking at the potential that there is for cultural diplomacy initiatives in civil society. In my conclusion, I'm going to try to bring together the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy recommendation for how these different sectors might work more effectively in the future. So the first lecture, as you probably remember, was asking this question, can culture influence the way that people think and act? First example that we saw was an example of the U.S. State Department actually sending musicians around the world. And namely, there was the interview with the Secretary of State Clinton, where we saw the example of hip-hop music in Syria. So the way that Secretary of State Clinton expressed it is she said the U.S. State Department is playing chess on a multi-level chessboard. And what she was referring to is they have the hard power strategies, they have the soft power strategies. They're sending hip-hop groups on the one hand and dealing with hard power negotiations on the other hand. And I thought that was a helpful analogy that we learned from Secretary of State Clinton, this multi-level chessboard. And I think there I'd like to underline the fact that I think cultural diplomacy alone can't do it. Soft power alone can't do it, just like also hard power alone can't do it. So in that sense, Secretary of State Clinton would say, yes, culture can influence the way that people think and act, but it's only part of the puzzle. So I think part of the rationale behind the State Department sending hip-hop musicians to places such as Syria was to try to show other aspects of American life, other aspects of American culture, with the hope that one can, in a positive way, influence the way that people think and act. One of their agendas is, of course, to improve the image of the United States abroad. But beyond that, they're trying to also maybe send messages in terms of different ideas, American ideas, that might have a positive impact on countries around the world. So that's the first interesting example we saw. The second example that we saw was Afghan Star, which is actually not officially an example of cultural diplomacy. But I think it did demonstrate for us how sometimes something cultural can have an effect far beyond culture. So here you have two Afghani entrepreneurs who started a TV show, similar format to American Idol or Britain's Got Talent. And really that TV show, according to Ambassador Cynthia Schneider, is actually helping to influence the way that people think and act in Afghanistan. And her main thesis is that if you look at Afghan Star, first of all, men and women have equal participation, which is a big deal in Afghanistan, where that wasn't the case for a long time. Secondly, the entire country has access. Not everybody in Afghanistan has internet, but almost everybody has at least one, if not two cell phones. And the way this works is, of course, you vote via SMS votes. So suddenly the entire country is participating very democratically in a TV show. So to a country where democracy is maybe a very foreign idea coming from the outside in an artificial way, this TV show, you could argue, is a great prototype of democracy. And if people can cast in their votes via SMS for Afghan Star musicians and superstars, why can't they do the same theoretically in a political context? And that's the main thesis that Professor Schneider was showing us. Again, Cynthia Schneider would say culture can influence the way that people think and act. And this TV show is a concrete example of the proof. The final point that I'd like to make on this issue of can the culture influence the way that people think and act is to remind you all that culture is not always a good thing. Cultural diplomacy can have bad consequences. Soft power also can be a dangerous thing. We outlined the example of Osama bin Laden, who Joseph Nye would argue is an expert of soft power. As we discussed earlier, bin Laden didn't pay anyone to fly into the World Trade Center. He didn't scare them to it. He didn't force them to do it. He attracted them to his interpretation of quote-unquote religion. That was bin Laden's soft power. So again, a word of caution that culture can influence the way that people think and act. That's not necessarily always a good thing. If we go to the 4 points of analysis that I suggested to you, agenda, agent, vehicle, target audience, a lot has to do. Who is the agent of cultural diplomacy and what is their agenda? And that can really determine if the vehicle of cultural diplomacy has positive or negative constructive or destructive outcomes. So that's the first important point. In summary, I would say, of course, there is a need. The culture does have a chance to impact the way that people think and act, but that's not always a good thing. The second point that we discussed is, what is the need for culture diplomacy? Is this really just persuasion propaganda as it was during the Cold War? Today, living in an interdependent world, where is the benefit? Where is the value added? How can culture diplomacy really help? And here we had a great quote from Walter Laqueur, who at the time was the co-chair of the International Research Council at the Center for Strategic International Studies, who said the following: "Far from being on the verge of a new order, the world has entered a period of great disorder. In facing these new dangers, a re-examination of old priorities is needed. Culture diplomacy, in the widest sense, has increased in importance, whereas traditional diplomacy and military power are of limited use in coping with most of these dangers." So the main point I was trying to make in this section of the lecture earlier this week is that we live in an interdependent world. As much as we may want to be free and to be independent and to do our own thing, and the USA does this, and Brazil does that, and China does that, that doesn't work anymore. The key global challenges that we're facing are global challenges. Poverty, environment, terrorism, global climate change. These are not issues that a country can or should try to solve alone, meaning the essence of diplomacy today, the core, the biggest need of diplomacy as a whole, is cooperation. Diplomacy should help to enable more cooperation. And I would say culture diplomacy, same goal. Good culture diplomacy will actually enable further cooperation, not promote one country's image or do propaganda or advertising, but really allow for and facilitate more cooperation. That would be a great cooperation, a great goal for culture diplomacy. If culture diplomacy can bring us to the point where we understand each other, where we trust each other, then okay, cooperation can take place. That's for me where I see the biggest need for culture diplomacy today. Get that bridge there in the first place. Strengthen the bridge if there already is one between cultures and countries. If not, create the bridge so that one does have dialogue, understanding, and trust between all aspects of society, not just the governments. And if you can do that, then there's really a chance to make a difference. So that would be for me the changed goal of cultural diplomacy in the future, really to help make contributions leading to more collaboration as a whole. And that's really for the benefit of the world, not necessarily only the benefit of the countries. However, of course, I would argue it's in the country's interest as well. Climate change. Okay, yes, we're helping the world, but we're also helping ourselves. We will all, every country of the world, be in a very difficult situation if climate change continues the way that it is. So that's where I see the biggest need for culture diplomacy in today's interdependent world. From there, the opening introductory lecture was dealing with those two main questions. Can culture impact the way that people think and act, and what is the need for culture diplomacy? Then we began to zero in on the coming lectures into the three main sectors: public sector, private sector, civil society. With the public sector, the main transition that I was trying to outline for you is the role also that global governance can play. For a long time, most of the 20th century, culture diplomacy was about one individual government promoting its own agenda, more or less, through culture diplomacy. British Council, Alliance Française, Goethe Institute. The transition we're seeing today is actually global governance institutions. And the examples that I outlined for you were from the United Nations and the European Union. They're multilaterally doing a new form of multilateral culture diplomacy. What I was trying to encourage you to think about in the course of that lecture is that, in my opinion, is the future of culture diplomacy. The world is getting more and more multilateral, more and more global. Culture diplomacy, I feel, should as well. And we saw a few examples. UNESCO is one of the most powerful examples of the UN really doing cultural diplomacy work at a truly global level, whether it's supporting local communities, local projects, or also global communities through preservation, through promotion, through education, through all of the different vehicles that we learned about when it came to UNESCO. Alliance of Civilizations, as we move to the right of the screen, is a second example where the UN says, look, September 11th happened because there was a lack of dialogue, there was a lack of understanding, there was a lack of trust in the world. The world wasn't prepared for this. Let's flip it. It's not a clash of civilizations, as Samuel Huntington was talking about. Let's make an alliance of civilizations. And I think the idea of the alliance of civilizations definitely is to be commended upon the initiative initially of Spain and Turkey. That was when this whole thing began, as we know, alliance of civilizations. However, the caution that I raised in the whole discussion about civilizations is exactly that word. I think we have to be careful using the word civilization, whether it's in a negative sense, a clash of civilizations, or a positive sense in the alliance of civilizations. That's my only word of caution, but I think the idea of allying these regions, these countries, is of course a commendable one, and I think it will help us to come to a point in time when maybe terrorism is less likely to occur. I think the more work of alliance of civilizations, the more work of the UNESCO, the better this world will be. The other examples that I gave you was actually threefold. Erasmus from the European Union, doing educational exchange, offering many opportunities for Europeans and international citizens to study abroad in a variety of places. Second example was Leonardo, a similar European initiative allowing people to have work experience and professional experience, internships, etc. abroad. Both of those, I think, are actually maybe my favorite examples of culture diplomacy. Culture diplomacy at its best, facilitating access. That's it. So not saying Germany is like this, France is like that, just facilitating access. Come, study in Germany, study in Italy, pick your own professors, pick your own classes, make up your own minds of the country, go home. And in the sad sense, first of all, you're giving those participants something they need. Education, or in the case of Leonardo, professional experience. They need that to build their careers. Secondly, you're allowing them the chance to look at their own identity through the eyes of others. By living abroad, I think you can really fully understand your own identity. How do I know what it means to be American unless I leave America and I live in some other country? Then I can see how I'm perceived abroad, how I'm presented abroad. So I think, first of all, that's helpful for the individual to understand themselves. Secondly, of course, in the spirit of culture diplomacy, study abroad or working abroad or these internships abroad of Leonardo allows you to learn about the other culture. So obviously living in Spain or Italy or wherever will allow you to learn about Spanish culture and identity, German identity, etc. So really, at three levels, I think these examples of Erasmus and Leonardo are great. It's also a powerful example and also a proof that multilateral culture diplomacy is possible. That if, in this case, 27 countries can agree and come up with these great initiatives, that gives me hope that actually more similar multilateral agreements can also be made. So again, we're seeing this shift. I think the benefit that I see of multilateral culture diplomacy is it requires more humility. It's less me and my agenda, my country's agenda. It's more what's better for the region. And I think if we're looking into the sense of the region, then it's easier for us to ask the next question, what's better for the globe? And then I think culture diplomacy really can make contributions to the benefit of global society and global citizens, as opposed to just for one particular group or another particular group. Final example that I mentioned to you in this section looking at multilateral culture diplomacy was unique. As I said, this is a network of the national cultural organizations of each of the European countries, Institut Cervantes, Institut Français, Goethe, etc. They're coming together. Right now it's just a network. But what I was suggesting to you is maybe this would be a model for actually a partnership with culture diplomacy in the future. Maybe unique could even become institutionalized and actually working on behalf of these institutions. And maybe over time, let's say 10 years, 15 years from now, maybe instead of having a Goethe Institute in a country, we would have a unique institute, which would represent really the European identity. Where within that unique building, for example, one could have actually all of the European countries represented. Overall, that would be actually much more efficient. You wouldn't need to have separate buildings, separate staffs, etc. And it would also be more in the spirit of Europe, in the sense really representing this mixed salad identity to a greater degree. Yes, an olive is still an olive, a tomato is still a tomato, keeping this analogy of the salad, but it's presented in one transparent salad bowl. Maybe unique could actually be that salad bowl. So hopefully that also has been interesting to you in terms of really inspiring you to think, what forms of cultural diplomacy might we see in the future? Is it possible to have multilateral culture diplomacy? I showed you a selection of examples that I think proves that it is possible, and it's for you to decide what are the benefits or disadvantages of multilateral as opposed to unilateral. So that was the main point that I wanted to underline when it comes to multilateral culture diplomacy and also global governance institutions. From there, we went into really a pioneering field, which is a field where unfortunately you don't have so much research. I'll refer you again to the Culture Diplomacy Outlook, 2011, where we do have a whole section dedicated to the private sector. Beyond that, there's not so much research there, but what I was trying to show you here is that I think the private sector has already now a huge role when it comes to culture diplomacy, and that role could even be increased. So let me go over the key points from this lecture, because again, this is new information, this is very pioneering, and I want to make sure that it's clear for you all. Now, I gave you a number of definitions of corporate social responsibility. The one that I prefer is one from Harvard University in terms of really trying to ask the question, what responsibility does the private sector actually have for culture diplomacy or for anything? And I think this definition expresses it relatively well. Harvard University Corporate Social Responsibility Initiative of the John F. Kennedy School of Government says the following: we define corporate social responsibility strategically. Corporate social responsibility encompasses not only what companies do with profits, but also how they make them. It goes beyond philanthropy and compliance and addresses how companies manage their economic, social, and environmental impacts, as well as their relationships in all key spheres of influence: the workplace, the marketplace, the supply chain, the community, and the public policy realm. So this is really a holistic definition, talking about really the responsibility that companies have, first of all, to do good things for society. Secondly, to practice what they preach. It's not enough just to preach culture diplomacy. You've got to practice culture diplomacy. So that's why I prefer this definition in terms of what role does the private sector have. That was the first definition that I think is very important for us to understand when discussing what role does the private sector have in a multipolar world when it comes to culture diplomacy. The second point that we made was looking at really the United Nations mandate and in particular the principles for responsible investment. I referred to the UN Global Compact, where basically the UN is trying to set the standard. What are the norms, what are the standards that global companies need to actually abide by? As we learned, it's totally voluntary. Right now it's over 850 companies who out of their own free will have signed up and said, yes, we would like to actually abide by the UN Global Compact. And I think it's a start. So this is showing how also a global governance institution can help to maybe collect and bring some order to a sea of very diverse CSR strategies around the world. Typically, CSR is very fragmented. Every company does their own thing. So initiatives such as the UN Global Compact is showing how maybe corporate culture diplomacy could actually be done in a more collective way, increasing the overall efficiency and ultimately helping citizens more. If we have 10 or 15 companies focusing on the same initiative in the same region, probably that'll be a more successful program than if it's just one company or another company for a limited period of time. Key thing here is partnership and also sustainability. And that's where I think the UN Global Compact actually does have a lot to offer, even though it is just a start and even though it is just voluntary. The next point that we discussed, we had an interesting video lecture talking about patient capital and the potential it has for the future of corporate culture diplomacy. Very, very important. I would encourage you to revisit this lecture as well, because it's key. I think if you understand those very small and specific and very influential influences that companies can make by investing capital in local communities in very simple things, not giving the individuals fish, but teaching them how to fish and helping them enable to start up their own fish businesses, to keep with the analogy, you can have a great impact. So I thought that was a very helpful lecture to explain to us the potential that is there. This then led us to the final part of the section. What is corporate culture diplomacy and what potential is there? I'd like to review this once again for clarity, because again, it's a new concept. This is actually, as of the Institute for Culture Diplomacy, how we define corporate culture diplomacy. First of all, corporate social responsibility, CSR programs, are dedicated to activities that ensure that the company is operating in a responsible way towards the local, national, and global environments. For example, a company might work to counteract externalities like pollution, or create a foundation dedicated to providing educational grants to students who would otherwise be unable to afford college. That's the first simple definition. Then, CSR can be a key facilitator of culture diplomacy, helping to build dialogue, understanding, and trust between companies and their clients, as well as potential clients, all over the world through grants, educational programs, and sponsored community initiatives. The stronger relationships between the company and its clients, the more trust will grow, and the easier it will be to foster both consumer activity and general goodwill towards a corporation. Corporate culture diplomacy also helps present a more accurate and comprehensive picture of the particular corporate environments and the ethical standards a company subscribes by. By initiating campaigns to counter misconceptions regarding the activities, the company can increase its credibility and legitimacy while simultaneously heightening its local, national, and global profiles. The strategy can go a long way to mitigating potential conflicts. So what I'd like to underline here is the chance that I think companies have today. As we look at the interdependent world of today, first of all, we have, let's say, the Arab Spring, where we see the possibility where governments no longer can just do whatever they want. And even in the time of dictatorships, the people can actually have a voice and even overthrow governments. We're seeing similar indications of this kind of a phenomenon in the private sector. Occupy Wall Street would be one example, where also citizens are saying, enough is enough, Wall Street. And I think there we're seeing that I think it's going to be more difficult for the private sector to continue unless they really adapt corporate culture diplomacy in a serious way, in terms of really building that dialogue, understanding, and trust with their clients, with their potential clients, with their investors, of course with their employees, and with the local communities around them. So that's how I think is, let's say, an extended version of CSR, if that can really become corporate culture diplomacy. In the end, we feel the company can benefit in two ways. First of all, the company's performance and their profits, we believe, can be increased. The better the corporate culture diplomacy, the better that company will operate, we feel, and also the better their image will be, meaning it'll be easier for them to do business, to get clients, etc. So we think, first of all, the company can benefit itself. Secondly, of course, will benefit society, because really the most successful corporate culture diplomacy isn't just helping employee A and employee B of the company, but really helping society and the communities where, first of all, maybe your clients are based. Also, the communities you're working in are also getting resources from. And that's really how corporate culture diplomacy can accomplish two goals: helping the company and also society. To demonstrate this to you, I illustrated two examples, which I won't go into again now, but in particular Deutsche Bank and BP. There are many other examples. These companies, the reason we chose them is they emerged relatively high in an index, in a survey that the ICD did, looking at the global companies. In terms of magnitude, these companies are doing a lot. I'm not saying anything about the core business of the companies. I'm not trying to also, do advertising for any companies. But I did think both of these organizations did show us different ways in which they can actually engage with society. Deutsche Bank, as I mentioned, one of the things they created was their own museum, the Deutsche Guggenheim, where they really are trying to actually bring art to the forefront, use art as a way of not only bringing people together, but also educating, and they have a number of themes in the exhibitions which can do a lot. Deutsche Bank I also referred to as sponsoring the Berlin Philharmonic, again, enabling the symphony to take place. Beyond that, there's the Deutsche Bank Americas Foundation and many other initiatives that they're doing. Deutsche Bank has about 12 major initiatives in the field of corporate culture diplomacy to make a difference. BP is also doing many, many activities. One of the more interesting that I mentioned to you can see on the screen, is where they actually were allowing citizens to really participate in the Royal Opera. And by having screens outside, every citizen could actually experience this. Not only the people in suits and ties who were inside and could pay the opera tickets, but those outside as well. So again, a great example how a global company really was coming to the people and helping to bring culture to the people. Only two examples. There are many other examples. But I think it's clear to you that really the private sector already is playing an important role. And I think in the end, we're going to need that. Governments and civil society can't necessarily do it alone. So I think my prediction is we'll see more and more corporate culture diplomacy in the future. And the role of the private sector will actually increase in the years to come. The final sector that we dealt with was civil society, and I gave you 4 different examples or definitions of civil society. The one example was the United States situation, where basically civil society was a grassroots phenomenon, started on the ground and really went up. Citizens coming together to help other citizens, really in its purest form, coming from the people for the people. In the US, it's very common for civil society to work together with governments, and also there's no problem of that kind of a relationship. That was the one scenario I painted for you. Second scenario I painted for you was Turkey. Over a long period of time in Turkey, it was actually very difficult for civil society organizations to begin. As I was saying, it was very regulated by the government, and there was really a distrust where the Turkish government said, hey, look, people coming together, forming groups, networks, this can be a risk. What's going to happen with that? And it was heavily controlled by the police and also by local administration. A serious registration process had to take place before you could even begin. We did a conference at Sabancı University in Turkey, I think it was in 98 or so. At that point, it was 7% of the Turkish population that it actually was participating in civil society, so not so much. Today it's more. With the European process, we're seeing civil society really emerge in Turkey, and it's changing. But that's a second setting in which civil society emerged. Third example I gave you of a different context for civil society was, let's say, countries where one has corruption in the government, dictatorships, or other problems in the political field of a serious nature. There, very often, civil society is defined as being against government. So it's either you're for the government or you're for civil society. That's it. So the idea that civil society would work with government is impossible in these settings. And so there I referred to a few African countries, even some Eastern European countries, not too long ago, where it was very difficult to actually be part of civil society and have anything to do with the government. That was the third scenario. The final scenario that I gave you was the example of Japan, where we had really civil society coming from the top down, the Japanese government essentially giving funding to citizens and starting NGOs that way in the 70s, when the Japanese realized they had no civil society and no cultural diplomacy. So it's important that we recognize the fact civil society can mean different things in different settings. So I just wanted to reiterate that now and make it clear before I make my next point regarding the great role that civil society can actually play. I gave you 4 examples. There are many, many more. The Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is also an example, really a civil society organization, citizens coming together to help other citizens. The main point that I was trying to show here is that we think it really makes sense for all of us, every citizen of the world, to ask ourselves, what is our responsibility when it comes to cultural diplomacy? If we agree that there's a need for cultural diplomacy, if we agree that there's a benefit for cultural diplomacy, what can we do? Is it just a matter of paying taxes and leaving it to the government? Are the governments the best suited for this? Is it a matter of just buying products like good capitalists and then let the companies use those profits to do the cultural diplomacy themselves? Or is it a different thing in the sense really that civil society, that we ourselves should actually engage? Should we be concerned about our neighbor or just about ourselves? And if we should be concerned about our neighbor, what does that mean? Should we actually actively be promoting cultural diplomacy in our jobs, in our personal lives? Should we go even further and actually do initiatives to help even local communities where we live? And there, of course, my belief is that civil society needs to be involved. As we look at the big timeline for cultural diplomacy, what I presented to you at the earlier lecture was that cultural diplomacy is nothing new. It didn't begin with governments. It didn't begin in the late 1800s with Alliance Française. It began centuries ago, really with the first human beings that moved from one situation and lived in another situation, whether it's travelers, voyagers, pilgrims, etc. They, in effect, were cultural diplomats, in my opinion. They were doing cultural diplomacy. They were representing their cultures by everything they said and everything they didn't say, everything they did and everything they didn't do. So that would be, for me, really in its purest form, citizen or civil society cultural diplomacy. Citizens coming together and accomplishing this dialogue, understanding, and trust, which did happen. Obviously, there were conflicts also over time, but there were also cases where you had dialogue, understanding, and trust. That would be really the beginnings of cultural diplomacy. Therefore, as we talk about civil society today, I would argue what began as something inherently for the people, by the people, cultural diplomacy, we had an interruption, more or less the 20th centuries, where governments basically took charge of cultural diplomacy and said, this is ours. Let's use cultural diplomacy as a way of promoting our agendas. And I think what we're finding today is something that started with the people is going back to the people. And really, civil society initiatives have maybe not necessarily the strongest chance of success as opposed to public sector, private sector, but definitely an equal chance. And I think there are many cases where civil society actually has a greater chance. And I think civil society initiatives can do even more than public sector or private sector. One example I gave there is, let's say, in a post-war situation, if you have a government that was involved in a hard power strategy for 4 years, for 8 years, I think it's going to be difficult for that government to do soft power immediately afterwards. People won't trust it. They'll say, hey, wait a minute, this is the same government that was bombing us 4 years ago, and now they're here trying to do soft power or cultural diplomacy. The legitimacy factor is an issue. So in those cases, I would say, again, there's no general solutions, but one thing to think about is that the government not engage in cultural diplomacy, but leave it to the citizens. And let's say, the citizens of that country themselves will have initiatives. You'll probably have more authenticity, more legitimacy from those NGOs who weren't involved in the foreign policy that was, the years before. So one example where civil society can even have a stronger potential than the public sector. So what I'd like to do now to conclude is basically show you 2 final slides to try to bring this all together. I think you've been sensing my overall thesis throughout the lecture, but I wanted to articulate it once and for all very clearly. For the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, we really see the future of cultural diplomacy, the power of partnership. Unfortunately, up until today, again, I'm generalizing, but for the most part, the public sector did their thing with cultural diplomacy, civil society did their thing, and the private sector did their thing. That's a problem, I think, in the sense you don't have overall efficiency. First of all, there's possible duplication. Secondly, there's possible inefficiencies or other issues when one has 3 different sectors operating relatively fragmented. And I think that's the problem, so to speak. The opportunity would be if one can really forge partnership between all 3 sectors. So if we can have a cultural diplomacy initiative where we have the public sector working with civil society, working with the private sector. There are some examples that exist today of this, but not so many. And there are a number of benefits of this. First of all, public sector in many countries of the world is always changing. So in the USA, every 4 years there's an election. So, if the Democrats have some great cultural diplomacy strategies for 4 years, the Republicans may come and do something completely opposite, and the pendulum swings back and forth. In Germany, you have even more parties, and there's all kinds of possible constellations, meaning you don't have a stability, actually, with the public sector. Yes, the embassy buildings will always stay the same, but the ambassadors will change, just like the foreign ministers will change, just like the presidents and chancellors will change. So therefore, that's a challenge for the public sector. How do you have sustainability with cultural diplomacy if it's always changing like that? Especially in cases where it may swing the pendulum in one way or the other way, depending on the political structures of the country. So that's a challenge of the public sector. Challenge of the private sector is that they're always looking for profits. A for-profit company, at the end of the day, that's their goal, to make money. So people are always going to have a certain distrust with the private sector culture diplomacy and say, aha, this company is not doing it because they want to help society. They're doing it because they want to make money. So that's a challenge for the private sector, how the private sector can, over long term, really have authenticity. So people say, you know what, they're here for the right reasons. They're here because they really do want to make a difference. And I think if we can achieve that, it's better for the companies and also better for the people. Civil society has the problem very often. They don't have the resources, right? A bunch of dreamers with good ideas, some non-for-profit organization, but how do they realize those ideas? And that's where I think the three sectors can help each other. The public sector and the private sector can help to give resources to the civil society, whether it's financial resources, political resources, support, partnership. There are many forms. But I think in that sense, civil society, usually speaking, needs help. Civil society can help to counterbalance the agendas of the private sector and the public sector. As soon as you have a partnership of all three, everything is more neutral. It's harder for people to say it's all about governmental interests if there's the private sector also partnering. It's harder for them to say it's all about governmental interests when civil society is also partnering, and the same goes for everyone. So by bringing the agendas together, we're actually distancing ourselves from the agendas, because it's clear to everyone that certain compromises need to be made. And each has an agenda. Civil society has an agenda, private sector has an agenda, and the public sector has an agenda. So by balancing them, we haven't achieved neutrality, but we're getting closer to neutrality. So I think it's really a win-win situation for everyone. Of course, each of the sectors brings with them their own expertise and their own experience as well. So you're really getting all of the benefits of the expertise and the resources of each sector, bringing them together. The problem with this, of course, is it's not easy, and it does mean balancing the different agendas, and that's, I think, traditionally why this hasn't been done. It's easier for a government to say, look, this is our culture diplomacy, let's do it. And for them to make a partnership with the private sector, with civil society, it's difficult, it's more work, etc. So I'm recognizing the fact that this scenario is a more difficult one to arrange, it's more challenging. However, I think the benefits outweigh the disadvantages, and in this case, really one can have a much larger impact for culture diplomacy if these three sections are coming together. The final slide that I'd like to show you is the final step of this. So I don't know if you agree with me in terms of the benefit of partnering between these sectors. If you do, I would then take it to the next level. And you not only have to do this within a country, so getting, let's say, if we wanted to do a new German-Turkish exchange program, you don't just want to have the public sector, civil society, and private sector working on the Turkish side, but you also need that on the German side. So the key final step of this little equation is get the partnership between the sectors in both countries, and then get those countries partnering themselves. So if we have, let's say, an initiative that's designed to educate, enhance, and sustain the Turkish-German relationship, get the Turkish private sector and the German private sector involved. Get the Turkish civil society and the German civil society involved, and the Turkish public sector and the German public sector. And then you've achieved an even greater ideal, where, again, you're even more neutrality. This is not a program about promoting Germany's interests, because both governments are involved. It's not a program concerned with one Turkish company's interests, because you have the German companies as well. So I think there, again, you're achieving more and more neutrality, more and more authenticity, and bringing more and more skill sets to the program. By getting the expertise, in this case of Germany and Turkey, this German-Turkish program as a whole is going to be more effective. So this would be, for me, the ultimate example for how really at an international level, culture diplomacy can really flourish. And I think the benefit of this, it's more efficient. These programs are going to be cheaper for each of the sectors involved because they're bringing together other resources. They're going to be easier because they have a variety of different partners and different tools they can use. And ultimately, I think the effect will be greater of these initiatives for the global good. And I think this is perhaps the next evolution. So I was trying to refer to you in this lecture the evolution in the public sector of unilateral initiatives getting more and more multilateral, and take that into account with the growing need of the private sector or the growing interest of the private sector to get involved, and civil society, and you have a complete picture. So this would be, in summary, the recommendation that I would offer for you for how cultural diplomacy might be constructed in the future. So as you see from the diagram, it's more complex than just having a Goethe Institute or a British Council, but in the end, I think this will enable those Goethes and those British Councils to do even more. And I think the power of partnership is clear, and I think will be a benefit, not a disadvantage, for each of the partners included, as well as a benefit for the civil societies and the broader communities of each country. I hope this lecture was helpful for you in bringing together some of the vast diversity of different examples that we gave over the course of this course on cultural diplomacy in the multipolar world. And I very much look forward to continuing with you with the lectures looking at the future of cultural diplomacy in the upcoming lectures. So thank you very, very much, and I hope this was enjoyable.